This video is sponsored by Bootcamp.com. Check it out for INBDE prep and use coupon code MENTALDENTAL for 10% off. Hey everyone, Dr. Ryan here, and welcome back to our dental anatomy series. This video is dedicated to the topic of working and non-working movement. Now, this is a topic that I hear about all the time in the comment section on YouTube and on my Patreon page, and I really want to do this topic justice because it will appear on dental school exams, on your board exams, and it's a very, let's say, complex topic. There's a lot going on, and it kind of reminds me of the perceptual ability section of the dental admissions test. You're visualizing something in 3 dimensions, in 3 planes of space, and that's why I spent so much time in the last video harping on the sagittal, axial, and coronal views, because you really have to think about this in 3 planes, otherwise it doesn't work. So we're going to start with an image from the last video, and if you have not watched that video yet, stop watching this one and go watch Occlusal Contacts. It's the 17th video in this dental anatomy series, and do that first. So you'll recall from that video, we looked at how the teeth come together in all 3 planes of space. And this is our coronal plane image revisited. And we're sitting at the back of the patient's throat, looking out of the patient's mouth. So their left side is on the left side of the screen, and their right is on the right side of the screen. And this is the primary view I want you to visualize when we talk about working movement. So what is working movement? Well, first, let's figure out what is doing the moving. So the maxilla and all of the upper teeth is one unit, and it's fixed to the rest of the skull, so it cannot move. The mandible and all the lower teeth is another unit, and that part can move. But all of the lower teeth are going to be forced to move together as one unit because the mandible is one bone. So if this lower left molar is moving to the left, well, this lower right molar also has to be moving to the left. So what can this mandible really do? Well, it can open and close, so these teeth can move up and down. It can slide forward and back, which we'll talk about more later, and it can move from left to right. And that's what we're going to focus on right now. The simplest way to think about working movement is the side matches the direction of movement. In other words, a mandible moving to the left means that the left side is the working side and the right side is the non-working or balancing side. If the mandible is moving to the right, then the right side is the working side and the left side is the non-working or balancing side for that given movement. So it changes dynamically as the mandible moves around. Okay, Dr. Ryan, I get that, but why does this really matter? Well, the teeth contact in a very distinct way depending on if it's a working side or a balancing side contact. Think about it. If the mandible is moving to the left, this lower left molar is going to slide against these 2 inclines of the upper left molar. And you can simulate this with a typodont if you have one, or just put your fists together, one on top of the other, and slide the bottom one to the left and feel how your knuckles hit together as you try to slide your fist. It's the same idea here. Those red lines are going to be what's in contact. Everything else will not be. Now on the right side, the balancing side for this movement, there is only one incline that's going to contact when that lower right molar moves to the left. and that's because of how the teeth are arranged differently on that side. Now notice how all three of these red lines are parallel with each other. If we extend these out, they're all parallel lines. Why? Because remember, the bottom teeth are forced to move together as a unit, so they're going to clash with the upper teeth on both sides at the same angle. So remember, the left side is the working side in this case because the mandible is moving to the left. So these are your working side contacts. Specifically, the lingual incline of the maxillary facial cusps contact the facial incline of the mandibular buccal or facial cusps, and the lingual incline of the maxillary lingual cusps contact the facial incline of the mandibular lingual cusps. And when I say lingual incline, I mean literally lingually facing incline. And so a facial incline means a facially facing incline. And then the balancing side contact is between the facially facing incline of the maxillary lingual cusps and the lingually facing incline of the mandibular facial cusps. Play that whole part again if you need to, because that is so important to understanding this topic. So here's a mirror image of the last slide. Now the mandible is moving to the right, so the right side is your working side, and the left side is your balancing side. And I know I'm repeating myself over and over again, but I really want to drive this concept home for you. So then these are your two working side incline contacts and the one balancing side contact on the left side. Again, all three of these purple lines are parallel with one another. It's a mirror image of the last slide. By the way, the working side contacts here are a lot more, let's say, desirable than the balancing side contact. In other words, if we're fabricating a crown or doing an occlusal adjustment and we're testing occlusion with articulating paper, we want to see these working side contacts. We don't really want to see too much of a balancing side contact because they tend to be a lot more uncomfortable for the patient. But what we really don't want to see, which I talked about in the last video, is the non-functioning cusps in contact. So, in order of good to bad is number 1, functioning cusps. They should always be in contact. Number 2, the working side contacts. Number 3, the balancing side contacts. And then last, number 4, the non-functioning cusps should never contact. That is what I'm going to call the Dr. Ryan hierarchy of occlusal contacts. By the way, this is a high yield fact. The most common source of a balancing side interference is going to be the palatal cusps of maxillary second molars. They're usually the culprit if you're looking for some kind of balancing side interference. All right, so here's our axial plane, again revisited, and note that our right and left have now switched from the last slide, and that's because our view has changed. Now we're looking up at the roof of the mouth with the maxilla and all of its teeth. And here we have the mandibular fossa, where the mandibular condyles sit. So again, the patient's right is on the left side of the screen, and their left is on the right side of the screen. This big green arrow at the center is pointing toward the patient's left because the mandible in this example, which is not shown in this image, is going to be moving to the left. Remember, the maxilla is fixed to the skull and it cannot move. So imagine the mandible is sliding towards the patient's left. This makes the left side the working side and the right side the non-working or balancing side. Notice what the condyles are doing. Notice how the condyle on the working side pivots or rotates, while the condyle on the balancing side slides down the articular eminence. So ironically, the condyle on the non-working side is doing a little bit more work here, and that's because of the nature of the mandible. It's one bone with two joints that are forced to work together. Also, side note, if you're familiar with these terms, Bennett movement occurs at the working side, Bennett angle occurs at the balancing side. That's just an aside. If you're familiar with those terms, just something to keep in mind. Lastly, I want you to notice the contact point on tooth number 14. If you use our picket fence from the last video, you can quickly figure out that the functioning cusp that would be contacting this particular red dot is the distofacial cusp of tooth number 19. And that was actually one of our practice questions from the last video. So during working movement, left side mandible is moving toward the left side. That distofacial cusp tip of tooth number 19 is going to travel to the left through the facial groove of tooth number 14. That's what this little green arrow is showing here. We'll go over this in more detail later, but definitely remember that. It's traveling through the facial groove of tooth number 14. Now, which side is the working side? Well, because the mandible is moving to the patient's right, everything on the patient's right is working. Everything on the patient's left is non-working or balancing. So now the right condyle is pivoting and the left condyle is translating. Remember how straight that arrow looked on the last slide for the working movement? Now look what's going on. Remember, this is the balancing side now. That distofacial cusp of tooth number 19 is traveling to the patient's right and forward over the transverse groove of the oblique ridge. Remember that one? That was back in our maxillary first molar video, but I mentioned that anatomical groove for a reason. So why is that cusp not just traveling straight to the right, you might be asking? Why is it traveling at such an odd angle? Because we're at the mercy of the condyles. The teeth can only move where the mandible is allowed to move, so it follows the direction of the condyles. The best way to visualize this is to print out this image, lay it flat on the table, and take a math compass, one of those old school devices, and put one part of the compass on this green dot of the working condyle, and then put the other part of the compass on the functioning cusp contact. You lock that compass and then rotate it, and you will visualize exactly how that distofacial cusp is forced to travel. And you could do the same for the last slide as well. You would just put the compass on this green dot and then on this red dot, and you would see how the mandible is forced to move. The teeth are forced to travel in the same direction as the condyles. Now, to complete the trifecta of dynamic occlusion, here is protrusive movement, where both condyles translate forward. So all the mandibular teeth will move straight anteriorly or mesially as both condyles move forward and down their articular eminences. For this one, the distofacial cusp of tooth number 19 will be traveling through the central groove and eventually over the mesial marginal ridge of tooth number 14. Nice and easy. So to review, we have working movement, which occurs out of the facial groove, balancing movement, which occurs over the transverse groove of the oblique ridge, and protrusive movement straight through the central groove. And I want you to remember these three arrows. We have a 10 o'clock, a 12 o'clock, and a 3 o'clock for all of you analog clock people out there. So this is going to be crucial to remember. Lock that in your memory. So here is the axial view from the last video, and here is the coronal view from the last video. And here is the occlusal grid. Just like the picket fence, the best reproducible tool to answer questions on your board exam. Everything here is color-coded to help you visualize what's going on. Remember, from the last video, the facial range of occlusion is in blue, the lingual range of occlusion is in magenta, and that's also shown to the right for your reference. So let's go back to the grid. What does all this mean in the middle of the slide here? Well, each of these rectangular boxes is a tooth from, in this case, maxillary canine to maxillary second molar, which is a one-to-one reproduction of this image, by the way. It's a one-to-one reproduction of that diagram, just kind of simplified so you can reproduce it easily on the exam. So it's kind of like we peeled off this section of the diagram from the patient's upper left quadrant and just pasted it right here and drew those curves to represent the ranges of occlusion. And then each box on the bottom is the mandibular canine to the mandibular second molar. And it's arranged purposely a little bit inside to represent the mandibular teeth being inside of the upper teeth, arranged in a proper non-crossbite occlusion. Each of these, we'll call them points of interest, all of the functioning cusp contacts are numbered on this grid. So all the facial mandibular cusps are numbered in blue, as well as the fossa and marginal ridges of the upper teeth that they contact. And the lingual maxillary functional cusps are numbered in magenta, as well as the fossa and marginal ridges of the lower teeth that they contact. So that's the setup. It's like looking at the picket fence from the axial view. And you might be saying, okay, Dr. Ryan, this is great. I can reproduce this, no problem. But how does this really help us? Well, I'm glad you asked. We have to add our arrows. Remember our distofacial cusp of number 19 example from just a few slides ago? Well, that is the blue number 8. That's the distofacial cusp of the mandibular first molar. And look where it's contacting. The central fossa of tooth number 14, the maxillary first molar. So that matches up. And then remember, the working movement occurs out of the facial groove. And just imagine, this is a one-to-one reproduction of this image over here. So that's point number 8, and I'm just drawing that arrow out like this. So that's the working movement. The balancing movement occurred over the oblique ridge. So that occurs like that. And then the protrusive movement occurs straight through the central groove to the mesial marginal ridge, just like that. And so these arrows to the right here represent the actual physical movement of the mandible and the mandible's teeth. So then the exact opposite directions can be used to describe the mandible. Stay with me here. We know that the maxilla is stationary. It cannot move. For protrusive movement, for example, we know the maxilla is not moving and the mandible moves forward. So relatively speaking, the maxilla moves backward. I'll say that again. If the maxilla is not moving and the mandible is moving forward, then the maxilla is moving backward relative to where the mandible is going. That's why everything is projected in opposite directions onto the mandible, including the working movement, which is now in this direction, and the balancing movement, which is now in this direction. Literally, completely 180 degrees opposite of what we saw up here. Hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to rewind and play that again if you need to. This is so important. All right, so let's put it to the test and practice with an example. If the mandible is moving left, the buccal cusp of the right mandibular second premolar may contact what cusp? Okay, wow, that's a mouthful. And you might read that and think, like, I have no idea where to begin with that. Hey, that's okay. That's why you're watching this video. We'll go step by step, break it down, and you'll realize that with the right process, This is actually very, very straightforward. So step number 1 is locate the cusp in question. Buccal cusp of the right mandibular second premolar. Okay, forget about right and left right now. We don't care about that. We just care about mandibular second premolar buccal cusp. So here's the mandibular second premolar. Here is the buccal cusp. That's contact point 4 on the mandible. We're going to circle it. Okay, step number 2 is find what it occludes with in the opposing arch. So all we have to do is find number 4. Here's blue number 4. We're going to circle that. Step number 3, the last thing to do is determine the movement. So because we are moving to the left and we're talking about the right side of the mouth, the side does not match the direction of movement. So this is a non-working or balancing side movement. Play that again. If the direction of movement does not match the side, it is not a working side. It is now a balancing side contact. So we can draw a balancing side movement arrow. That's the B arrow here. What do we see? We see that cusp is hitting number 3, that magenta 3, which corresponds to the lingual cusp of the maxillary first premolar. And there you go. That's the answer. The lingual cusp of the right maxillary first premolar. And there you go. That's all there is to it. Let's try another one. In a right lateral excursion, the mesiolingual cusp of the right maxillary second molar passes through what structure? All right, let's follow the process. Step number 1, locate the cusp. So we're talking about the mesiolingual cusp of the maxillary second molar. Again, we don't care right or left right now. So here's the maxillary second molar, and we're talking about the mesiolingual cusp. That's going to be the magenta contact point 11. Step number 2, find where it occludes in the opposing arch. That's going to be contact point number 11 in the lower arch. And that corresponds to the central fossa of the mandibular second molar. And then we circle it. Step number 3 is determine the movement. Because we are moving to the right, and this is the right side, you already know what I'm going to say. The side matches the movement direction, so this is a working movement. So we use the W working arrow. And so this would be moving in this direction. So that mesiolingual cusp is moving lingually through the lingual groove of the mandibular second molar. And that's it. That's your answer. No need to overthink it. Just move on to the next one. Well, let's do another one. Let's do one more. Okay, so during a non-working movement on the right side, the mesiobuccal cusp of tooth number 14 will pass through what structure? Oh my goodness. Okay, it's worded a little bit differently, but that's okay. Stick to the process. When you know you're dealing with a dynamic occlusion question, just stick to this process. Step number 1, locate the cusp in question. Mesiobuccal cusp of tooth number 14. This time we're getting a tooth number. So tooth number 14 is the maxillary first molar. Again, don't worry if it's right or left side right now, just that it's a maxillary first molar. Here's the first molar. We're talking about the mesiobuccal cusp. Oh no, now what do? There's no number here. We don't have a point of interest number. That's okay, don't worry. Remember, we only marked the functioning cusps, and this is a non-functioning cusp. It follows the bull rule, buccal upper. So we just have to be a little bit creative. So we find, here's the mesiolingual cusp. Here's the mesiolingual cusp, number 7. So the mesiobuccal cusp has to be somewhere out in this vicinity. So we'll just circle an empty spot there. That's the mesiobuccal corner of the maxillary first molar. Step number 2, find where it occludes in the opposing arch. So we can see that we're to the right of 6, 7, and 8. So we find 6, 7, and 8 on the lower arch, and we just reproduce our circle to the right there. Step number 3, determine the movement. Now, be very careful with this part. So tooth number 14 is on the left side of the mouth, and we're being told this is a non-working movement on the right side. So let's go back to this slide for a second. If the mandible is moving to the left, that makes the left side the working side and the right side the non-working side. So if there's a non-working movement on the right side, that's basically the same thing as saying there's a working movement on the left side. And because tooth number 14 is on the patient's left side, that's what we care about. We don't care about what's going on for the right side. We care about what's going on the left side and that it's a working movement. So we go to where we left off. We draw a W working arrow, and now we see that the mesiobuccal cusp of tooth number 14 will be traveling through the facial groove of the mandibular first molar, specifically tooth number 19. So that's a really challenging one. Go back and think through it again if you need to, but once this makes sense to you, you've got it. You truly understand dynamic occlusion. And again, stick to this 3-step process and you will be golden. So a summary, you locate the cusp, you find where it occludes in the opposing arch, and then you determine the movement. Does the direction of the movement match the side the movement is occurring on? Is it a working or non-working movement or protrusive? And then draw the arrow to match the appropriate movement. Stick to this 3-step process and you will be able to tackle any dynamic occlusion question you get on your exams. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching this video. I really enjoyed doing it. This is a topic I'm super passionate about. I love occlusion, how teeth fit together, how they function, and I understand it's hard. I understand it's challenging, but you can do it. Think through it in all 3 planes of space. Rewatch, draw things, get a typodont, get a dentiform, use your knuckles, be creative, and you will get this. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to this channel for much more on dentistry. If you'd like to support me, please check out my Patreon page. And thank you to all of my patrons for their support. You can unlock access to my video slides to take notes on and practice questions for the board exams, so go check that out. The link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.